lot of reasons. One of them is that I'm not a technologist, and I would venture to say that probably everybody in this room has more technical knowledge than I do. So I'm looking forward to this discussion with you and the questions that you might have, even as I may not be able to answer them. My name is Elliot Harmon, and I'm with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Raise your hand if you have not heard of the EFF. Let's try that. A few people, good. Thank you so much for coming. When people ask me what EFF is, I usually say it is a digital rights organization, which always leads to the question, what are digital rights? And the answer to that question is there's no such thing as digital rights. It is a made-up term. There are only your rights. Your right to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, privacy, your right to freedom of religion, your right to assembly. And those rights should not change whether you're talking about the internet or you're talking about meat space or something in between. However, as technology develops and changes, there are always forces out there arguing that when technology moves, your rights need to be relitigated. That, for example, because end-to-end encryption exists, you should no longer have your right to privacy. Or that because police departments now have very sophisticated surveillance technologies that they can use to track your movements around a city, that you should no longer have your right to due process. And EFF is the organization saying, no, your rights are your rights, and they should not change when technology changes. And we have a number of different venues in which we defend your rights. We do quite a bit of litigation, but we also do a lot of work outside of the courts. And I'm one of the people in the organization who works outside of the courts. I talk to lawmakers and policymakers, urging them to protect your rights in laws and policies. I spend a lot of time talking to EFF members, talking to people like the folks in this room, urging you to write and call your members of Congress and to get involved in other ways in defense of your rights online. Oh, I forgot. There's a little piece of housekeeping that I'm supposed to do. The organizers of this wanted everybody to read a couple of rules. I don't know the specifics. Apparently there were some problems yesterday, so they just wanted all of the speakers today to reiterate a couple of rules. The first rule is that a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. The second rule is that a robot must obey orders given to it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And the final rule is that a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. Is there any question about these rules? Can everybody kind of agree to follow these rules for the rest of the day? Okay, good. Obviously, this is a silly joke. I've been reading Isaac Asimov's 3 Laws of Robotics. But I brought those up for a specific reason because I think that they're very, very pertinent to this discussion. In particular, that second law, that robots must obey humans. And indeed, that question of whether the machines that we own should do what we tell them to is really the central question in the debate over DRM. DRM stands, depending whom you ask, for digital rights management or digital restrictions management. And I think it's useful to spend a couple of moments explaining what I mean when I use that phrase DRM. Because I think that what a lot of people picture when they hear that term is a piece of the pie, but it's actually a very small piece of the pie. So yes, when we talk about DRM, we are talking about things like the old iTunes Fair Play system that sought to prevent you from putting the music that you bought on more than a certain number of devices, or to play it at all on devices that Apple did not approve of. Or they're thinking of things like DVD encryption that seeks to prevent people from ripping copies of a movie on their computers or making a copy of those DVDs. This sort of DRM in what you might kind of think of as traditional digital media is certainly a big part of the discussion in DRM, but it's not all we're talking about. And I would argue that this is actually a decreasing size of the pie because this is an area in which the rights holders have kind of given up. When we talk about DRM today, we're talking about things like this. We're talking about farm machinery having locks on it, preventing farmers from doing maintenance and repairs on it, or preventing them from taking it to an independent repair shop, essentially bricking a tractor if somebody besides the certified repair technician attempts to repair it. We're talking about things like this. We're talking about medical devices and researchers being blocked from these locking technologies from conducting research on flaws in these medical devices, flaws that could potentially be deadly. And we're talking about our ability to hold manufacturers accountable. We're talking about locks that prevented researchers from checking Volkswagen's work with its emission tests and determining whether Volkswagen was lying to the public. So that's the kind of thing that I mean when I talk about DRM. I mean not just with iTunes or ebooks or media like that, but I'm talking about any attempt that a manufacturer of a piece of media or a piece of technology uses to place a kind of artificial limit on its functionality, to draw a line between what the user of this product is allowed to do with that product and what she is not allowed to do. And DRM, in our opinion, puts a stifle on innovation and on lawful and innovative and experimental and exciting and creative uses of technology. And incidentally does a very poor job of locking up the things that it is supposedly intended to lock up. And it's easy when you think about it for a few minutes to understand why DRM is not very effective at, for example, keeping movies off of the internet. It's because of what is sometimes referred to as the smartest cow problem. I do not actually know how to hack the DRM on a DVD. I don't know how to do that. But other people certainly do, and so I don't need to. If there is one cow that is smart enough to unlock the lock on your gate, then it doesn't matter how high your fence is, all of the cows are going to get out. And so DRM is not only ineffective and it is not just a bad idea, but it is unfortunately a bad idea that has been written into the law. Under the 1998 Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Is everybody here familiar with the DMCA? I assume most people are. And I'm guessing the main way you're familiar with it is when you see things that have been removed from the internet because of takedown requests. The notice and takedown regime is one of the big parts of the DMCA that has caused a lot of kind of trouble over the years. But another thing that the DMCA did is it put the force of copyright law behind digital locks. So here's the relevant text. It says, no person shall circumvent a technological measure that effectively controls access to a work protected under this title. Now let's unpack that a little bit. Where this sentence appears is in the US federal statute relevant to copyright law. And so when you see that phrase, a work protected under this title, you understand that it's not just talking about music and movies and things like that, but it is also talking about software, as you know, is copyrightable. And so what that law does is it allows manufacturers to create these locks, preventing any use that they don't like of a certain piece of a piece of technology that they offer, with the force of criminal law behind it. And I want to be clear, when I say that 1201 makes circumventing DRM illegal, I don't just mean that it breaks the terms of service or that it voids your warranty or that it voids some kind of contract you have with the manufacturer. I mean illegal with the potential for both civil and criminal liability. I've been talking a lot recently with a colleague of mine, Cory Doctorow, who is a very well-known and very well-respected author. I'm guessing most of you are familiar with his work. If you're not, you should be. He and I were talking about DRM the other day, and he pointed something out to me that I'd never really thought about it in quite these terms before. When you see these icons on a computer screen, you understand that they're not referring to literal objects. When you click on that scissor icon, you do not believe that there is actually a literal pair of scissors inside your computer cutting something out. Software is built on many, many layers of abstraction between what's literally going on in the machine and what's going on in the user's brain. And I like talking with a crowd of geeky people like this because you guys understand those layers of abstraction. And so you understand when you look at this thing that yes, this thing is a rice cooker, but it is not only a rice cooker, it is also a computer. And so there are things you can do with this computer that the manufacturer of this computer, calling itself a rice cooker, would have never imagined. Similarly, when you look at this object, you understand that it is not only an automobile, it is, more importantly, a computer. And so there are things you can do with this computer that the manufacturer would have never imagined or approved of. And indeed, there are risks that come with using this computer that do not come with those other machines that look a lot like this computer. And you all understand that. Now we are in this weird situation where treating the rice cooker like the computer that it is and treating the car like the computer that it is potentially illegal. The law shouldn't protect metaphors. There is fortunately some recourse, and that's because the Copyright Office runs this process whereby the public can officially request exceptions to DMCA 1201. This takes place in a process that happens every 3 years. It takes about a year to put your case together for why you should get this exception from the Copyright Office. And then it takes the Copyright Office about another year to decide whether to grant that exception. And this is a process that takes place every 3 years. So you can put the math together and see that this is really an around-the-clock job. We requested, we're just at the beginning of this process right now. Last time around, we requested and were granted 4 really important exceptions to DMCA 1201. The first of those has to do with car security research, repair, and modifications. So this is exactly the kind of thing we were talking about earlier, and exactly the kind of thing that came up in a high-profile story where there were hackers that figured out how to drive these cars around remotely. So this is an exception specifically for research on security and safety issues. So it's certainly not talking about like customization for people's entertainment or enjoyment or a better driving experience. It's really talking specifically about security and safety of those automobiles. The second one of these, this was actually an expansion. A couple of cycles ago, we got jailbreaking for mobile phones. This past time, the exception for mobile phones was extended another 3 years, and they added to that tablets and some kind of similar devices in the tablet category. I know. Third is archiving and preserving video games. This one is a little bit obtuse, but I'm guessing that in this room full of nerds, there'll be a bunch of people who understand this. When there are certain video games that you can only play if, when you first open it up, it connects to this remote server to identify that you have an official copy of that video game. The problem that happens is when, at some point, that server is taken offline, the video game becomes, for all intents and purposes, worthless. And so we got this very narrowly defined exception specifically for games that no longer have their core functionality when that server goes down, bypassing DRM for the purposes of restoring that functionality. So this is really narrowly tailored, and it's not addressing a lot of the really kind of cool other customization things that people do with video games, but it is an important exception nonetheless. And the fourth one of these is remixing videos from DVD and Blu-ray sources. So this is talking about not just ripping a DVD for the purposes of having another copy of it to give to your mother or whatever. This is talking about ripping it for the purposes of doing some kind of fair use work with that content, be it making some kind of remix video, be it some kind of parody, something like that. We'd already had this exception for DVDs, but it got extended another 3 years and Blu-rays got added to it. So we've had some wonderful victories in this rulemaking process, and I suspect we're going to have some even more wonderful victories this time around. But let's be honest, that's not how this is supposed to work. Innovation thrives when you have broad leeway for exploring and experimenting. Think about the protections for innovation that exist in copyright law itself, where we have this very flexible fair use doctrine that is flexible so that it can adapt and change with new ideas and new changes in technology. That's how it's supposed to work. You're supposed to have these very broad, very flexible exceptions that you can then explore with and use to find new ideas and create new business models. Sometimes I like saying about fair use that it doesn't place a fence around innovation. Fair use is more like a lantern that you can kind of carry with you and find new possibilities. But unfortunately, when it comes to DRM, that's not what we have. What we have looks something more like this. We have these really specific paths that are granted to us by the government every 3 years, and we are told only to stay on those paths and not stray from them. And it is very, very easy to see the chilling effect that that has on new innovation and new ideas. And keep in mind, the prohibition in 1201 is not only against circumventing DRM, it's also against sharing information. It's also against sharing with other people information about how to circumvent a certain kind of DRM. In a sense, it's easy to forgive Congress for creating this mess. Because remember, Congress passed the DMCA in 1998. And in 1998, when people thought about DRM, they were mostly thinking about music and movies and things like that. They were certainly not thinking about that we would very soon be at a time when there is software on everything, when there is software on rice cookers, when there is software on toilets, when there is software on refrigerators, and yes, this is real, when there is software on egg cartons. So they did not think about that they were creating this situation in which manufacturers could exert a great deal of control over what their customers do with their products. On the other hand, though, it's kind of Congress's fault that we got here, because they were creating this fantastic incentive for putting those locks on these devices, where a manufacturer cannot just have the license agreement and have your warranty voided or something like that, but actually have you risk criminal litigation for simply doing something beyond what they intended with that product. And that's why we sued the Copyright Office, as well as the Department of Justice. This is a case that is currently pending in a district court in Washington, D.C. I would encourage you guys, if you haven't, to actually read the brief that we filed, because it's very interesting. And a lot of times legal briefs are sort of difficult to get through if you don't spend a lot of time reading them. This one is very readable and compelling. I'm not going to read this whole paragraph to you, but I'm going to read a couple of sentences from it. These provisions broadly restrict the public's ability to access, speak about, and use copyrighted materials without the traditional safeguards, such as the fair use doctrine, that are necessary to protect free speech and allow copyright law to coexist with the First Amendment. Skipping down a little bit, that triennial rulemaking process by which the public may seek exemptions pursuant to Section 1201 does not alleviate these problems. Instead, it itself is an unconstitutional speech licensing regime. When you have a government office saying what kinds of speech are lawful or not, that is literally the very thing that the government is not supposed to do. I'm guessing a number of you have already seen this or heard about this. About a month ago, EFF made the decision to drop out of the W3C. This came after a very long process whereby the W3C was deciding whether to incorporate DRM in the form of a spec known as encrypted media extensions into the official HTML5 specifications. We believed for a long time as this debate was going on that to do so was really compromising what the very purpose of the W3C was, having this set of open standards that every manufacturer, every browser can adhere to, and suddenly using that set of open standards to do something that is inherently hostile to users seemed to us to be very much the wrong direction for the W3C to go in. But I want to be clear about something here. That's not why we left the W3C. We didn't leave the W3C because they incorporated DRM into the HTML specifications. We did it because when it became obvious that this was going to happen, we went to the W3C and said, okay, let's, as a body, make an agreement that we won't abuse the law, that we won't wield it against security researchers, that we won't use DMCA and the similar laws that exist in other countries against people who are not circumventing DRM for any unlawful purpose, but are doing it specifically for the purposes of protecting users' security. And when the leadership of the W3C could not at very least agree to doing that, that is when we realized that our time as a member of the W3C had to come to an end. I've been really negative during most of this discussion, but the fact is I'm not actually very pessimistic about this issue. I believe that this fight is winnable. And I'll give you a very, very specific example of why I think this fight is winnable. At the very beginning of this talk, I put up that iTunes logo and I mentioned the Fair Play DRM. Raise your hand if you've ever bought a piece of music protected by Fair Play DRM. A few of us really old people, and I bet you there are probably some people in the room who don't even know what we're talking about. Because the market moved. Fair play was really, really annoying. It was annoying to have to go through this process of registering and deregistering devices. It was annoying that there was kind of this support for third-party devices, but it didn't exactly work all the way, and like sometimes you could listen to a song, but you couldn't fast forward it or something. And frankly, it was annoying that you couldn't try it with new devices, just as smartphones were becoming a thing, and there were all of these MP3 players and things that it would have been so cool to listen to your iTunes music on. And so the market changed. And similarly, I believe that when it comes to software DRM, the market can and will change too. And that is where the very people in this room come in, because you are the people who look at this object and don't see a rice cooker, you see a computer, and you understand what that means, and you understand what people can do with that computer. And you are the people who look at a Volkswagen Jetta and don't see a car, you see a computer. And you can think about what it's possible to do with that computer, and you can also think about the security implications that are created by that computer, and the dangers of that computer, and the potential bugs that we need to be able to research and understand. The people in this room understand that stuff, and as you teach the public about those possibilities, and as you teach consumers, users, whatever you want to call them, not just what exists now, but what is possible, the market demands here will change too. There is a proposal that has been introduced in about 12 state legislatures, including North Carolina. That blue screen is so hard to look at. Sorry that I'm hurting all of your eyes. But what this is a state law that would require that manufacturers make the information about how to disassemble and maintain their products available both to the public and to independent repair people. And if those devices have on them any kind of digital locks that would confound somebody's ability to do maintenance and repair, then it requires them to provide that information as well and to provide a means of circumventing it. This is a really, really great idea, and it's a way of making a great deal of progress without amending the DMCA. It's been introduced in 12 states. There's a group of folks called the Repair Coalition that is behind this thing. And if this is something you're interested in getting involved with, again, the bill has been introduced in North Carolina, but I don't actually think that a lot has happened with it since it was introduced. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong about that. But absolutely get in touch with these folks. If you don't know how to get in touch with them, then get in touch with me. Sorry about that. And I will get you in touch with these folks because this is a really exciting thing happening. And the final thing I'd say is to go back to that rulemaking process itself. As I mentioned earlier, it's a complicated process putting together these appeals for exceptions to 1201. And one of the things that it requires is assembling stories of researchers, of hackers, of businesses whose work is confounded by these digital locks, of business models that would be possible without 1201 of business models that would be possible without 1201, that are impossible or put in kind of a gray area by the existence of 1201. These are the stories that are so useful for making our case. And incidentally, they're also going to be useful for making our case in court. And so if this describes any of you, if this describes your work, if this describes your business models that you have been dreaming up, or if it describes your research in security, in safety, whatever it is, then get in touch with us because your stories could be the one that tilt the scales on this stuff. So please, please do get in touch if this describes you. There are the images that I used. They are all Creative Commons licensed, and there are the URLs. If you didn't have time to jot those down, then you can find this whole presentation at EFF.org/ATO2017. It is on Google Docs. If you're not comfortable using Google Docs, then just shoot me an email, and I will send it to you as a PDF. So I would love to open this up to any questions. I can't guarantee that I will know the answers, but I guarantee I will listen to you. I agree. And I actually, yeah, I was a kid when the law was passed, and I don't know a lot about what went into those exact parameters. But a big part of making the case is showing that it does not compromise or does not at least severely compromise existing kind of entrenched business models. And so I think that there is kind of this idea of wanting to recheck the landscape every 3 years to see if conditions in the market have changed, or maybe even to see if those exceptions are having an impact on the market that they had not imagined. But the funny thing, though, is that it's usually the exact opposite that's the case. Apple is still selling a lot of phones, right? I have a suspicion. We will see. You can ask me in a year if I was right about this. I have a suspicion that you're not actually going to see a lot of opposition on renewing the phone jailbreaking this time around from the phone manufacturers. I think that there were some concerns early on, but those concerns just simply have not played out in any real way that affects their business models. Yeah? It's very frightening. And there are similar proposals that have been made by rights holders here. They refer to it as notice and stay down, and I think that there's a different term that they're using for it in the EU, and I can't remember what it is now. What these proposals all kind of have in common is that they vastly overestimate what automated filters are capable of. Because the people behind these proposals imagine that it's very, very easy to program an automated filter in a way that will never kill anything that is a legitimate fair use. And that's not possible. And I was arguing about this with somebody at our booth earlier today. I would argue that it'll never really be possible. That development in automated filters and in content recognition and all of that will never really understand the human context and will never understand the nuance that goes into a very flexible fair use analysis. There's, incidentally, this is kind of outside of the scope of this talk, but there's also in Congress right now a very, very frightening bill that would do the same thing, except not for copyright infringement, but for content related to human trafficking. And I think that this is a dangerous proposal for a lot of different reasons. Again, it's a little bit beyond the scope of this talk, but come talk to me in the booth later on and I'll tell you a bit about it. It's something I've been following very closely. Yeah?
Has there been any attempts or any serious efforts in Congress to get rid of DMCA?
There have been attempts. There have been attempts that end up getting just a small number of co-sponsors. There is a bill in Congress this year that has to do with jailbreaking. It's called the Your Own Devices Act, or YODA. I'm actually not extremely familiar with YODA, but the point is there are definitely attempts in Congress. They are both not the sexy issues in Congress and also not the issues that have very wealthy lobbyists behind them. And so it's going to be slow progress, unfortunately. Of course, I'm cautiously optimistic about what will happen with our case over 1201. So there are always other means of changing the law. Yeah.
You said you were optimistic about the war being winnable on DRM in the browser. I totally get your argument about fair play in iTunes, but I'm not sure why you're optimistic because fair play pisses people off. I don't hear anybody really mad about Netflix or Hulu. It seems like you're content with it.
That's a fair point. I would take that point. I would also say that the argument that proponents of EME have been making, that it is just less burdensome for consumers to be able to do all of this stuff in the browser as opposed to having a separate proprietary app for each video streaming service. That is a compelling argument in a way if you accept those as the only two choices. And that's when I think of the sort of longer arm of justice. I do optimistically see a rejection of DRM in that kind of content altogether. Because again, remember that thing where some hacker tried to blackmail Netflix by putting all of Orange is the New Black online? It didn't work because that stuff doesn't work, because they already know that all of that stuff is online, and yet people still subscribe to Hulu and Netflix. Yeah?
So how do you think the market moving towards streaming and basically these all-you-can-eat services where you don't really own anything anymore, so you just sign up for a service, you stream whatever you want, and then when the service you don't have anything for? How does that change the argument more against DRM?
That's a really, really good question. A former colleague of mine, Parker Higgins, who's kind of an internet celebrity, I'm guessing some of you know who he is, he wrote this really excellent essay called Yes, All DRM, essentially answering that very question, saying that basic principle that robots should do what humans tell them to is just as applicable in the current world of streaming services as it was in the world of downloadable content. Yeah.
So you said a couple of questions ago that you
Oh, that was my point, that there's other ways outside of Congress. Well, like in this case, one of the ways is litigation. What I would kind of call the other big way is through market norms. Yeah, and like that's a fair point. And of course, there's also this whole licensing versus owning discussion going on in software, right? As the way I see it, the public kind of accepted the idea of software being licensed to you, and then we realized the big mess that accepting that puts us into. You know, the thing that I would keep going back to with all of this is that smartest cow problem, that all of the Netflix content you can find in downloadable formats, and yet people still use Netflix. Any other questions? If not, then I want to, with the 5 minutes that we have left, I want to mention a couple of other things to you guys very quickly. EFF has always been primarily focused on national and international issues. We do a lot of work with what's going on in Congress. We do a fair amount of work with what's going on in trade agreements, as you mentioned. But when it comes to what's actually going on in Raleigh, we don't have the staff power. And it is increasingly at the city and state level where these issues are really, really important, with the rise of things like police surveillance technologies. And so we realized that we needed to deal with this problem in some way with some kind of mechanism for local action. And we thought about a lot of different models, and we realized that what you might think of as sort of the traditional model when a big organization decides to get into grassroots, where they like set up a chapter in every state, didn't feel right for EFF in lots and lots of different ways. And so what we did instead is we launched this thing called the Electronic Frontier Alliance, which is a network of groups around the country. I think that there are about 60 of them now. And there are student groups like hacker groups in there. There are kind of traditional old school civil liberties groups. There are maker spaces in there. There are 2 groups in this area in there. There's both B-Sides Raleigh and DC 919 are members of the Electronic Frontier Alliance. All that is necessary to be a member organization of EFA is, 1, to be a real group, to not just be a website, but to be a group that's actually doing things in the real world. And 2, to agree or to endorse, I should say, these 5 principles: free expression, security, privacy, creativity, and access to knowledge. Over the past year and a half or so, I've gotten to know a number of these groups and the really, really cool things that they're doing. And some of them are doing such cool things. They're doing local advocacy around police use of surveillance technologies. Some of them are doing work on the level of university policy. University policies around patenting is another kind of pet issue of mine that I will talk with you about later if you're curious. There are groups doing like security trainings for local activists and local communities. There are groups doing really cool things, and we get to kind of be this hub that just listens to all of them talking to each other and connects folks with other groups doing similar things. If this is of interest to you to get involved with these digital rightsy kind of issues on the local level, then I would strongly encourage you to either get involved with one of the local groups here, or if they're not quite the right fit for what you want to do, then talk to us and try to get something else started locally, because it's a really cool opportunity. And the very last thing I will say is anybody who is interested in continuing this discussion, we're going to have a little informal get-together tonight at 8 p.m. at a very super secret location. If you are interested in coming and chatting with us and having a beer with us, then I would love to continue the discussion there. Just go to our booth downstairs and we will tell you what the location of that is. I'm both being secretive because it's fun and also because I can't remember. But please come say hi to us there. And regardless, come say hi at the booth. We'd love to talk with you there. Thank you all very, very much.